Welcome to the Layman's Seminary. In this session, we're continuing our Final Destiny series in Numbers, and we're in part 3. And before we begin, I want to review where we've been in the previous videos because I created this series as a unit so that we're progressively learning, so that things are progressively illuminated as we go through the text, which means studying words as they occur in their context. It's a helpful way to move in that direction to internalizing things. So true to form, basically the way this series has come out is that the Final Destiny in Genesis part 1 was the initial, the pioneer. I can't remember what they call a show whenever it's a pilot, right? So it's a pilot, and it's walking through the material concerning passages that are mentioned in Genesis. Well, then I did that for Exodus and I did that for Leviticus. But by the time I got to Numbers, I was just overwhelmed by how much material that I had. And so I'm like, well, I got to start laying this foundation from the beginning. And so I went back and I made a Final Destiny in Genesis part 2. I made a one for Exodus part 2. I made a Leviticus part 2. Okay. And in these, I introduce certain words that are going to take prominent form in Numbers and in Deuteronomy. Then I got to Numbers, of course, and the first video, well, I'll show y'all. Anyway, so this is Final Destiny in Genesis part 2. You're introduced to 3 Hebrew words, as well as, the content that was already mentioned in Genesis. So you have Nekala, right? That's the noun form for share, inheritance. Yarash means to possess, inherit, to dispossess, even in some places. And then Halek, okay, or Halek. So which relates to share and portion. And so you will be exposed to these words in that video right there, and that'll build your foundation. Now we keep coming back to these words, but if you want to get the first exposure to them, I recommend you go back to this video. It actually started the video 1 because it's going to lay a contextual framework or reference point for you whenever you interact here. All right, so in Exodus, we encountered Bekor, which is the firstborn, and Bane. These Hebrew words have significance there. And then also in that word, in that video, we introduced Nakal, which is the verb form of the noun Nekala that was used earlier. So we have that going on for inherit. And then in Leviticus part 2, we see here that I have X's here. This means Nechala doesn't actually occur in Leviticus, at least that I saw, neither does Halek, okay? But Yarash is going to occur again. And then another word that we're exposed to is Azkara, which is a memorial portion. Zakar means to remember, and so it's related to that. Here's another one that's sort of similar. This is Axkutsa. I know I'm not pronouncing things right, but it's in the ballpark. Let's put it that way. Anyway, sorry about the distortion. I don't know how to zoom it in and still keep the circle. I'll work on trying to figure that out. But this word in Numbers part 1 is menuka, and it's related to a resting place, which in some places is synonymous with inheritance. Okay. Yarash, again, is mentioned in Numbers 1, going into detail about that. And Ruach is mentioned in Numbers part 2. And the reason Ruach is mentioned there is because it's going to deal with the issue about Joshua and Caleb having a different spirit and what that means contextually. All right, so here we are picking up where we left off in Numbers 2, but also where we're beginning today. We have the word inheritance, and portion, right? Well, later on, I'm going to show you how it relates to the Hebrew words, but let's just zoom in right here. Then the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, nor any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the sons of Israel. So we're all the way up to Numbers 18:20. Okay. Remember, we're walking through each book of the Bible as these occurrences occur. All right. So here's our word nakal, right? And so to cause to inherit, we've already gone through it, but you can see it's related to inheritance, possession, so on. Now, what I want to do here is I'm going to show y'all that Hebrew word nakal occurs 13 times in the book of Numbers. That's a lot of times. In fact, it's the most times it occurs in the Old Testament, as you can see. All right. Now, the other word, collect, for share or lot or allotment, it occurs 3 times, right? Not very significant by itself, but you can also see it occurs a whole lot in Deuteronomy and most in Joshua, which makes sense because that's whenever they give out the inheritance of the land, the lot. All right. And then here's Nechala, right? And we see for share or inheritance. Look how many times it shows up in the book of Numbers. 45 times, if I'm reading this chart right. It will show up 50 times in Joshua, okay? So it's a very significant concept in the book of Numbers. All right. All right, so when we're talking about the word concept, the English word for inheritance, the NASB translates Nekala, Nakal, Yarash, that's just with the Lamed preposition, same thing there, as inheritance, okay? So it's using these 3 words for inheritance. If you just look for the occurrence of the word inheritance in the NASB Bible, this adds up to 50 times, okay, that it occurs in the book of Numbers. If you go back and you'll count up the occurrences that occurred in the book of Numbers based on the Hebrew words that are related to inheritance, I think it comes up to 61. So either way of counting, you get the idea that it's significant. The word inherit uses the same words as translated the same. It may even be the same readout we get here, because look, we got 50. So they may just view that as one word group. Okay, so when we go to the word portion and do the same thing, we see there's lots of different Hebrew words for portion. There's collect right there. There's a couple others that are here, and so you could expand this study more if you wanted to. We're just dealing with the main ones that are interacted with in Final Destiny. And so if we run the word portion in the NASB, and don't worry, I'm going to do a King James evaluation in a minute concerning this. But the NASB has portion 5 times in Numbers, and the most times it's in Ezekiel. Okay. Leviticus is a lot too, but probably because it's related to the sacrifices. The word share, I was just taking the synonyms to look up so that I didn't miss anything. So you see no times in Leviticus, but you got some other examples throughout the Bible, even in Corinthians and so on, but they may be used in different contexts, but it makes sense about the fellowship emphasis stuff going on there in Philippians and Corinthians. So here's the word lot. Now they have Genesis 30 times, but that's probably not distinguishing the person lot from the lot as in a piece of property. Numbers, it occurs 6 times. Now the word allotted shows up in Numbers 4 times, right? Shows up a whole lot of times in Ezekiel. Allotment in the NASB shows up 4 times. So they may be considered a lot and allotment to the same. Okay, now when we're coming into the English word for possess, we see that most of these words relate to yarash. Well, this one does. So here's some other ones that we're being exposed to. Here's yarash, and we've interacted with this one in another video. So you could, if you wanted to enrich your study more, you could do the word studies related to them as well. So if you take the word possess in the NASB 95, forgot to mention that because I forgot there's more others out there. You see that it occurs 25 times right here. All right. A lot of times in Deuteronomy. Most times in Deuteronomy. So here's our word again. I'm sure I have 2 slides, but okay. It looks like I got 2. Oh, look at the difference, guys. This is possess, and this is possession. But like I said, it looks like they're basing them off the same idea, that possession and possess are the same. So here's the range for possession as well, 25 times. Now for inherit, yarash, we're going to narrow it down and just study yarash, which we've been exposed to in the other videos. The thing is that when you have yarash, it'll tell you number 1. So that's the number 1 root that it's coming from. And hopefully I've made those distinctions in the previous videos. If not, I just want to remind people of the root fallacy, that we don't want to fall into that. Numbers 50, for the word, let's see, what this is, yarash, and it occurs 15 times. Okay. Now I noticed here, usually I use the BHS, but this is the Lexham Hebrew Bible that counts from. So you may have some variation if you run your own count, but it still helps us get an idea for the feel of the significant words that are being used in the book. And like I said, things culminate in Deuteronomy with a lot of these words, and it makes sense because it's a sermon referring back to everything. This sermonic, like, put it that way. So we're going to interact with some of these statements here about Numbers 18:20. The Lord said to Aaron, "You will have no inheritance in their land, nor will you have any share among them. I am your share and your inheritance among the Israelites." Okay, so remember that in this discussion of inheritance, there's 2 types of inheritance. There's the inheritance, say, of that one inherits God, in the sense that you have a relationship with God, like the Levites were God's inheritance. Okay. And then you have the inheritance as it relates to reward, ruling in the land, the promised land imagery and stuff. All right. So this is the one. So you could think of it like this: is positional inheritance and experiential inheritance. And those that know me from whenever I talked about salvation know what I'm talking about when I refer to that. Position refers to an event that happens at the moment that we're saved. So it's sort of like that. Therefore, it is perfectly proper to think of living in a land where one had no inheritance or property. In fact, inheriting the land is far more than merely living there. We'll talk about the footnotes in a minute. Even though Israel was disobedient, they still lived in the land. They never inherited the land. They never possessed it fully because they were disobedient. The New Testament parallel may be found in the well-known distinction between the believer's legal standing as the heir of all things. And for those people that trip up on the word legal, I have no problem with using the term relational standing, because the reality is that a relationship has a beginning point too. It starts with an event, and so therefore the beginning point of it is positional as well. And what is experiential in a relationship is the intimacy, the level of commitment, those types of things like that fluctuate. But the beginning of the relationship, just like marriage, even though that's primarily contractual, or use the language of the Bible, covenantal, it can still be used in the positional way. And in other videos, I've developed the distinction, and there's a positional aspect to covenants, and there's an experiential aspect, and even the ultimate aspect. But moving on here, between the believer's legal standing as the heir of all things and his state, that is between his position and his experience. Just because all the blessings in heavenly places are ours, Ephesians 1:3, the believer must trust and obey in order to experience what is his. This is the same with every generation of Jews. The nation may be the legal heir of the land, but any generation can forfeit that inheritance and never experience it. Okay. So now we're interacting with the footnotes, and with the first footnote says the parallelism equates share with inheritance, and that's in 1820. How you saw that it was used the same. Okay, and then they're going to say see also 18:23-24, which we've already encountered in the book already. So now here Delo's interacting with N.T. Wright, and we'll give a quote from N.T. Wright in a minute. But it says that Wright in the New Testament, the people of God, he said Delo says experimental predestinarians. Remember, that's his word for a specific strand of Calvinism that is more on the Puritan mindset, that you got to do tests to examine yourself to see whether you're saved or predestined. Experimental predestinarians are troubled by the idea that a believer can obtain anything through their own devotion to God. Thus, all right, so let me clarify what's going on here. That the believer can obtain anything through their own devotion to God. Well, number one, I mean, I'm just going to speak from how I understand sanctification. When you're in fellowship with God based on confession of sin, sort of like the 1 John 1:9 idea, you're abiding with God, you are walking in the Spirit, and you're able to bear the fruit of the Spirit. That means that you are in fellowship with God and empowered by God, so that when you obey the word of God, it's God doing it through you. It's our responsibility to maintain our fellowship by confessing our sin, by yielding, by disciplining ourselves to renew the mind with the word and all of those types of things like that. But when we're in fellowship with God, it's actually God doing the work through us. So for anyone to object to the idea that we could obtain anything through our own devotion to God, they're missing the point. Is that what we're saying is God rewards us, not necessarily for what we do through what we do, but rather how often we allow God to do something through us. Now, I don't know if that's how Dillo articulates it, but that's how I articulate it. And I'm going to try to say that a little bit more, because there's some confusion out there through interactions that I've had with various camps about the issue of works and related to salvation and sanctification. I mainly try to clear up the issues concerning sanctification, because I've often found that whenever a person understands their sanctification better, they start understanding the salvation passages a lot better, and even the implications of the gospel. So moving on. Thus, all of these passages that seem to suggest that the inheritance is conditioned on the believer's works are countered by saying that even though the Israelites were disobedient, they still lived in the land of Canaan. Now, he uses the term experimental predestinarians, but I've encountered Lutherans, who, I'm not saying all of them, because whenever you meet somebody, they're just representative of that particular group. But that doesn't mean that they're the best representative. But the ones that I've encountered, they don't like the idea of rewards, because they think, for the same reason the experimental predestinarian does right here. And so the counter to people who believe in rewards, one of them is to say that even though the Israelites were disobedient, they still lived in the land of Canaan. So basically what they're saying is that because Israel was allowed to live in the land by grace, then there can't be a concept of rewards. But the problem with that is that even anytime we're talking about God giving us something, there's grace. There's even grace as it relates to rewards. Think about it. God is the one that gives us the provision to get into fellowship, to walk by the Spirit, to do those things, so that we can receive the reward. So God is involved from the very beginning, um, and so we can recognize that aspect is that grace. One way to think about it is this: is that in this world, and I know this is not a perfect analogy, but in this world, networking is important. But networking just gets you in the door. It requires your abilities, your responsibility. It's your responsibility to take care of your career. Now, God, in the spiritual level, He gets us in the door. He puts us in the playing field in position of salvation. And now that we're in the door, and that we have the potential to operate, we have His provision. Then what happens at that point is that we're able to minister. We're able to walk in the Spirit. We're able to serve Him. We're able to please Him in that way. And so that's the sense of where it's our responsibility. We're held accountable for that. It's related to the concept of stewardship. Even though the Israelites were disobedient, they still lived in the land of Canaan. One reason that I'm elaborating a little bit more about some of the things that are mentioned here is because I have Christian friends that are reading this material and interacting with this material, and they come from different traditions or backgrounds than me, and so I'm trying to clarify things, because whenever we're studying a book, I mean, it's set in, even when you're watching this video right now, it's a relic of time now. It can't be changed. I mean, I can make an updated edition, but this material is old. Hopefully it's not obsolete, but it's old from the moment that you view it, and it's up to you to go research it and evaluate it. And I constantly want to improve on the previous articulations out there, both in myself and in the people I read. And that only comes through interacting with other people who don't believe exactly the same as you, but are sharpening your mind concerning those issues. And of course, interacting with people within your own camp helps as well. Okay, so let's look at this red right here. Living there is then equated with inheriting it. So that the experimental predestinarian, these folks here that don't really like the concept of rewards, and not all of them are like that. We're just focusing on those that do. They try to think that because you're living in the land, that means you inherited it. But watch this. However, there is more to inheritance than living in the land. Someone may live in my house, perhaps as a guest or because I rented it to them, but I can assure you they will not inherit it. Okay. Inheritance implies ownership. And ownership, while unconditionally guaranteed to Israel of faith in the last days, will come only to any particular generation of Jews who are obedient. So God promises to give the land to Israel. And yeah, there's a sense where God's always delegating and all of that, but there's a sense where living there is not the same thing as inheriting. So that's what we're talking about here. And this reference to Israel faith in the last days refers to the tribulation, when the nation of Israel, a remnant of the nation of Israel, will be saved. The unconditional nature of the Abrahamic covenant will be finally fulfilled in the second coming. And I don't like the term unconditional nature. I like the term permanent, everlasting, non-dependent, or whatever, because there are conditions for blessing. Actually, this is why in my covenant videos, I kind of make this, I would say, the positional nature of the Abrahamic covenant. Not position for salvation, but position in the sense that it remains intact, regardless of whether a generation is faithful or an individual is faithful. So I would say the positional nature of the Abrahamic covenant will be finally fulfilled at the second coming. So this will be the ultimate fulfillment of it. And then this is when it occurs: when I take away their sins, and when the deliverer will come from Zion. Talking about God, of course. Whether a particular generation, and that's new covenant language, whenever a new generation of Jews inherited the land, depending on God's promises and their faithfulness to meet the requirements of the covenant. So that's the experiential sanctification aspect. And that's the experiential aspect of the covenant, if you will. Because my argument is the covenants are given as a means of sanctification. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about this for a minute. And I probably will talk about it in other videos, but I want to make this clear that when I'm talking about sanctification and the covenants, I'm basically saying this. There's what's called the revelatory means, right? The revelatory means that regardless of whether a covenant is in operation or not, it still remains a revelation of God. In other words, you can read it and you can learn about God's attributes. You can learn about his dealings with mankind, with angels, with humans, with Israel, with Gentiles, so on and so on. So, for example, even though we are not underneath the Mosaic law, it's still a revelation of God, and therefore it's profitable to be studying. I mean, this whole series is going from Genesis to Revelation. So that's the revelatory means of experiential sanctification. Then there's what's called the regulatory means, okay? Or you could say the experiential means. And what this means is this refers to whatever covenant or whatever code is in operation at a given time is how you walk by the Spirit, whatever time it is. So in other words, this is you applying the word of God during your time, and it includes drawing principles from other portions that covenants that are no longer in operation right now. So I want that to be understood, but you do this through principalation and application rather than the interpretation. And then you have the enabling means. And the enabling means refers to the Holy Spirit himself. Okay. So this is how I understand sanctification, is that you've been given the word and you've been given the Holy Spirit, and it's our responsibility to walk in the Spirit, which through confession of sin, renewing our mind with the word. We're given the Spirit and the word. And this has been true from the very beginning, even though they didn't have it in written form that we know of. Some argue that way. They did. I have no problem with believing that written records were early, and that Moses compiled some of it. But going on, I just want this to be understood, because when we're talking about the covenants are the regulatory means of sanctification. And the reason this is so significant is, like, when you come to the book of Galatians, which most people think is about salvation. Let me change my color so y'all can see this a little bit better. Let's go with red. All right, so when you come to the book of Galatians, which is about, I believe it's about experiential sanctification, regulatory means of sanctification. Some people get thrown off because it says curses anyone preaching the gospel than this. But gospel just means message, and context determines its content. And so when you're reading the book, the issue is he says, much more, having begun in the Spirit, are you trying to make yourself perfect in the flesh? That's in Galatians 3. And so the issue is that they are still being taught by these, if you will, call them Judaizers, that experiential sanctification is through the Mosaic law still. All right. That's what they're thinking. The Mosaic covenant is the regulatory means of sanctification. And Paul's saying, no, even though it remains a revelatory means of sanctification, we're now under the Christ code or the church code or whatever term you want to use. And so the problem is not so much salvation. The problem is that they're trying to be sanctified through the Mosaic law, in particular circumcision. And the reason this is so important is because you meet many Christians that want to keep the Sabbath. You meet Catholics that want to keep the 7 sacraments. You meet these other counterfeit means of sanctification. You know, the Sabbath is a good thing, but it was given to Israel. Okay. Whenever you replace a means of sanctification with a wrong means of sanctification, you are what Galatians calls fallen from grace. In other words, fallen from the principle of grace. It's not referring to losing salvation or anything like that, but you're falling from grace. Okay, so keep these ideas in mind. I can elaborate them in the future. I've written a paper related to this, continually developing this idea. But this clears up so many things, because there's a lot of times whenever we encounter Christians and the issue comes up, oh, well, you're a work salvationist, because we think, okay, they're Judaizers, because we think what's going on in Galatians is about these people are saying you have to be saved by law keeping. But no, I mean, there is the concept of justification, but justification in those passages, I believe, more relates to participating in the benefits of the Abrahamic covenant. In other words, the experiential aspect of things, which I've also developed about. But it has significance, because rather than using the term works salvationist, I think that we should adopt the term works sanctificationist, because that covers everything. And as I said before, a lot of times whenever you get your sanctification clarified, at least your theology about it, your doctrine about it, then you start seeing the gospel a little bit more clearly, or at least you become more consistent to whatever you believe the gospel is, because it's the implications of the gospel that relate to our sanctification. And so hopefully that cleared up some things for y'all. If not, I can make additional videos in the future, or recommend videos that I already have on that issue. Okay. All right, so here's the N.T. Wright book that Dilla was quoting, New Testament and the People of God. He writes a lot, of course, but this is just a good example. It said, this could not be clearer. Israel has returned to the land, but it's still in the exile of slavery under the oppression of foreign overlords. So he's going to give an example. I think it's from Nehemiah, where they're basically saying we're still slaves, even though they're in the land, So it shows you that inheritance is more than just living in the land. And I think the idea about living in a house that you're renting is not the same thing as owning the house. Yeah, I know the concept that we don't really own anything, because but if God gives it to us, he delegates to us, and we're responsible and accountable for it. All right, so continuing on. See, all right. So no generation of Jews has ever met the conditions, and no generation of Jews has ever inherited all the land for an everlasting possession, as the promise specified. Yes, the possession of the land is to be everlasting. They had it temporally, and they didn't have all of it. So this means that the promise has to be fulfilled in the future, if you take literal interpretation, which I do. Nehemiah will be surprised to learn that on their return from Babylon, the nation had inherited the land. He said, behold, we are slaves today. And as to the land which you gave to our fathers to eat of its fruit and its bounty, behold, we are slaves in it. To be a slave in the land in no sense fulfills the biblical promise of existing at rest and under the full blessing of God. Keep that in mind about that idea of rest. Rest from your enemies. Rest in the sense of not having to toil as much because the land is blessed. Sort of like the pre-garden imagery. When Jesus says, I wanted to gather you, but you were unwilling, in Matthew 23:37, and the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Are we to imagine the corrupt generation of Jews who rejected the Messiah were heirs of the unconditional Abrahamic promise? If so, why were they destroyed? They lost the inheritance because of disobedience. In other words, this is not talking about salvation here. This is talking about inheritance that could be lost because of disobedience. In other words, reward, rank. When Paul said that Israel had been cut off from the Abrahamic promise until the final generation of faith is grafted back in, are we to understand that the generation that was cut off because of their disobedience was an heir to the land? That generation, though living in the land, was disinherited and still in exile. Okay, N.T. Wright observes, they believed that in all the senses which mattered, Israel's exile was still in progress. The exile was not yet really over. This perception of Israel's present condition was shared by writers across the board in Second Temple Judaism. Now, N.T. Wright doesn't agree with this writer's view of eschatology and ecclesiology and probably even soteriology. Same thing with me. But I do appreciate his contribution to things, and there's people out there that that respect him. And so whenever we're quoting things, whether Dillo's quoting something or I'm quoting something, I'm not basing my support off of them, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, hey, you guys out there that come from this tradition, look at this. This is not just limited to free grace. This is expressed in your own writings, in your own scholars, in your own theologians. Okay. Then the other footnote we have here is from Robert Chisholm, and he's DTS. And this is from an article because does God change his mind? Thus, the fact that Israel inhabited the land during the time of the judges and the carnal kings of the northern and southern kingdoms in no way invalidates the fact that the inheritance was granted only to a particular generation based on their obedience to Yahweh. The fact that God continued to allow them to remain in the land until the Syrian invasion in 722 and the Babylonian exile in 586 is a manifestation of his long suffering and grace. So God allowed them to remain in the land. He could have dispossessed them in the sense of kicking them out at any time. It says his delay was because of his great mercy and grace. But during those times of unbelief and rebellion, they were not inheriting the land in the Old Testament sense that involved the blessing of God and not mere residence. They did not, in the words of Obadiah, possess their possessions. Okay. All right. So here's that journal article. It's right here if you want to go research it. So when we're going into talking about, I know we're in the Old Testament, right? The Hebrew Bible. But we need to start thinking in terms of how this relates to the New Testament. What words are used in the Septuagint for these Hebrew words that we looked at? And one of the words that we encounter is the Greek word meros, which means part, share, portion, and so on. And here's the root. And you'll see this other word here, meris, that comes off of it, which is another one that relates to share, portion, and part. And this comes in significance concerning John 13, some passages in Acts. There's several passages actually deals with this, but going on. So you see here that the Greek word meros in the Septuagint translates all of these Hebrew words here. So yod, that's actually hand. Let's see if there's any that. So I don't have time to go through all of these, but if you wanted to extend your research, you could go study these words as well, because the Septuagint is translating these, and that's the link to the New Testament. I mean, because the Septuagint was the Bible at that time, as well as the Targums. So here's meris, meaning district or portion. And here's the Hebrew words. This is related to collect. Minna or Minath, one of these we interacted with in one of the videos. I can't remember which one. And then this is Nakala. Okay. And so in John 13, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I want to make y'all aware. I will have an upcoming video on John 15. It will probably be separate from the Final Destiny series, but it'll be labeled John 15, so you'll be able to see it. I do have an older video on it, but I've been requested to do some work on John 15 that to make it into a more professional PowerPoint for some people. So I'll be working on that. So when Peter says, I'm not going to let you wash my feet, Jesus. And Jesus says, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. And so this idea of part is related to portion, share, inheritance. Remember, the disciples know that they're going to be ruling and reigning with Christ, and they can't wait to win. And so that's what this idea relates to. Part in ministry, part in reward, part in ruling. There's a lot we could go into about this, but we're just going to focus in on this right here. And then Peter says, well, wash me all over, And so here's a discussion about all of that. Well, like I said, we're going to focus on Meros. I am going to mention some of these resources that are mentioned here in footnote. But right here, part with him. The word is commonly associated with the inheritance. It is part in contrast to the whole. All right, so here's the footnotes. He's going to develop these in the section on inheritance. Vincent's Word Studies, the Ashland Theological Journal, Calvin's Commentary, the BDAG, the Exegetical Dictionary New Testament, and D.A. Carson's Gospel According to John. And I have these right here. So here's Vincent's Word Studies. Here's the entry here about the foot washing that's being quoted there. This is circled right here to let us know which footnote we're on. 232. So this is Ashland Theological Journal concerning that distinction between bathing and foot washing. Here's the actual quote. 233 is now where we're at. So that is John Calvin. Like I said, just like about N.T. Wright, we're quoting Calvin because there's other people that are Calvinists out there, that's their tradition, that's what they come from, and so they need to interact with that scholarship. And it's important not to be ignorant of anything, any contribution, whether positive or negative. In other words, how you evaluate it. So I believe in interacting with all the resources. That's my view about textual criticism as well. But I try to do my own exegesis as much as possible on my own. And then listen to what other people have said and compare it and adjust it and so on, like the hermeneutical spiral. So here's that commentary. This one is by Pringle. I have lots of commentaries by Calvin, different ones. And that's the thing when you're going through church history or you're going through these people, there's been several different translations. And I never know exactly, well, which one should I use? Some of them I got the Catholic version, some of them got the Protestant version, so if y'all think that there's a better one out there, then let me know in the comments below or whatever. So there's the quote from the Calvin on that. Here's the Institute, same thing. I got a couple of Institute versions. So we're now on the 234 comment about the contrast between the whole, and that's from the BDAG. Here's the BDAG, of course. This is Meros, the entry for that. And you'll see at this point in time when I made this slide, I had all my Greek stuff downloaded, but I'm in the process of, I got a new internal hard drive that I got to try to install so that I can fit all my Logos on here. Because I've been having to download my Greek stuff and then download my Hebrew stuff when I'm doing Hebrew. And my library's just gotten too big and I need to have it all in one place so that I can better answer people's questions and help them with the projects that I'm working on for them. Okay, so here it is in the BDAG, the entry here. You can go check that out. So right here, 235, Meris, which is basically synonymous with Meros. Now, these words basically synonymous are key because when you see the word basically, that means not always, okay? But it means essentially. The thing is that even when you're talking about synonyms, there's times of overlap and there's times whenever a word doesn't overlap. D.A. Carson talks about this in his exegetical fallacies and stuff. So just understand that when you're talking about when you come across a synonym, you ask, okay, what is the similarity and what is the differences all the time? But it says refers to a portion of the whole which has been divided up. One finds the word often used of an Israelite portion of the inheritance of the land in Canaan. Each tribe, except that of Levi, was to have its share at Meris in the promised land. Okay. And I'll show you the Septuagint version of these in a minute. Carson notes that the notion of having a part, Meros, in something is regularly used with respect to inheritance, e.g., and in Jewish stock can refer to participation in eschatological blessing. So it's a participative term. There's people out there that really like that word participation, or partner, or partaker, or all fellowship, concepts, service, experiential, those type of categories, middle column concepts. Luke 15:12 is instructive. And the younger of them said to the father, Father, give me the share, the meros, of the state that falls to me. And he divided his wealth between them. The term refers to a portion of share inheritance which is granted to the heir, a portion which is granted conditionally. Okay. And so that's what here's the footnotes for that, but I have them. There's the exegetical dictionary of the New Testament. There's Maris, where he's basically saying it's synonymous. This one, I didn't have all my Greek uploaded, but I do have the BDAG. So I'm slowly uploading the resources that are referred to one by one, rather than just everything that's classified as Greek. But I hope to put in that drive tonight. Okay. Going on. All right, so here I start going through and writing the Hebrew of these words so that we can be aware of them. We've exposed you all to the words in previous videos and in this video, and so we're just going to see how they start clustering. Like, for example, right here, nakal, the verb form, is used here, right? But then nakala, the see, I'm having some lagging right now. Hopefully it don't affect the video. Inheritance, the noun form, is used here, nakala, and then kalek is used for portion here. And so you can see here, this is the Septuagint as in parallel with the Hebrew for the passage. And so you got kalek here, and you got chimeras right there. And then Deuteronomy 12:2, you have nakala, and then you have chalek. And then here's chalek here. I'll talk about the equivalent of nekala in the Greek later on. There'll be a whole lot that when we talk about kleros and kleronomonia and all of that. Deuteronomy 14:27, he has no portion, chalek, or inheritance, nakala, among you. There it is again, chalek, meris. All right, so now we're here. That's the D.A. Carson footnote. Here's the resources talking about the gospel according to John. And here's D.A. Carson's quote. Here's the Badag again, Maris, for that. This is Numbers 18:23, the word no inheritance right here, when it's talking about the Levites not having an inheritance. Nechala is being used there. Ditto for this section right here, where it's talking about the tithing that goes to them, because they shall have no inheritance. Same thing here, the ditto, the tithe which is given you for them for your inheritance, you shall present an offering. This right here is just reminding you the concept that concerning the bronze servant, that looking resulted in living. That's what that's talking about there. In Numbers 21:24, then Israel struck him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land. So this is Yarash, and it's used in the sense of taking possession of his land, basically repoed. I think if it was his land in the first place, I have to look at the context. And then right here, you can see where the word is translated as dispossessed. Moses sent a spy out to Jazer, and they captured its villages and dispossessed the Amorites who were there. Yarash. It can be translated as drive out too, if I remember right, from the Exodus. So Numbers 22:35, we have, so they killed him and his sons and all his people until there were no remnant left, and they possessed his land. Yarash. Okay, that's it for this video, and then we'll be continuing with the next stuff. If this was a benefit to you, subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell if you want notifications. Give us a thumbs up. Share this with others. Let us know what you think, but most of all, keep this ministry in prayer. God bless.